you very much, everyone, for being here. Welcome to this plenary, and thank you, Enrica, for your lovely invitation, and to all the, sorry, my cursor is not working now, so that's not a good sign. There we go. Thank you, Enrica, for the invitation. Thank you to all the organizers of the symposium. Unfortunately, because of the time difference, I have been unable to join most of the presentations, but the program looks really, really interesting and amazing. And another good sign that we all continue learning, even on Saturdays. So again, thank you all. It's lovely to have the opportunity to have this connection with Canada, a country with whom New Zealand, interestingly, seems to share a lot, and a lot of interest in what happens with education and what happens with language teaching education, in fact. So it's a pleasure to have been invited to share some of my work with you. I hope I can give you some insights into what happens here, which might not be that different to what happens there. But I really appreciate the opportunity to share. I'll just start very briefly by sort of positioning myself. I am originally from Colombia, but have been living and working in New Zealand for 20 years now. And my work, as Anna, thank you very much for your introduction, already mentioned, is basically in a Faculty of Education in different languages, education programs. I don't teach the language, I teach about teaching the languages. And it's an interesting opportunity for me to look at a range of languages, because we get to work with teachers not only of what we call here the international languages, such as French and Spanish, Chinese and Japanese, but also the languages of the Pacific, because if you can see the map, little New Zealand in the middle of the wide Pacific Ocean, our closest neighbors besides Australia are many of the Pacific islands. So we have lots of immigrants from those islands, and some of those community languages are also taught in the school system. The New Zealand education system, where education is universally available, most students will start school at age 5, and there are the possibility of studying in an English medium school or in a Te Reo Maori school. So the indigenous language is very important in New Zealand, and I know that similar efforts have been made in Canada with your many languages. Of course, that would be a topic for a very different conversation, but what I'm trying to signal is that for us, languages are very present. However, there are some tensions between the languages because there's not enough resources for everyone. The curriculum is national, but there is a lot of freedom from the schools and expectation that the schools enact that curriculum and implement that curriculum according to their contextual needs. And typically a student will be in school from years 1 to year 13. The context of my work is mostly in school, so I will be talking about education in languages at school level. And the curriculum, which is currently being refreshed, by the way, was the current one that we have was launched in 2007 with an emphasis on preparing the learners at that time with a 21st century discourse with a range of transferable skills for active and successful participation in a very diverse multicultural society and an increasingly globalized world, words that will not be any different to many of you. Attention is given to the importance of developing students' intercultural capability. So the concept of interculturality in New Zealand comes in the wider curriculum, not only in the languages curriculum. And what is important for us to realize is that the learning area called learning languages, only became independent in the iteration of the 2007 curriculum and enacted from 2010. So although languages were taught, especially at secondary level before that, because the system of New Zealand comes from the British system, of course, heavily influenced by what happened there. So languages like French, for example, have been in the curriculum present for many, many, many years. But it was only introduced as a separate area of the curriculum in that 2007 curriculum, and to be implemented in 2010. However, taking languages is not compulsory, which is quite unfortunate for those of us teaching in languages, because many of the efforts that are being made, at least in the schools, as you will see in the presentation, tend to be driven by what the community or the principal wants to do more than for a national language policy that is, as I said, quite unfortunate. Now, there is current work on a refreshed curriculum, but unfortunately, the signals, at least from the current government, are not very, very hopeful that we will have a stronger mandate in learning languages. Again, a topic for a different conversation. I'll just move on. In terms of the curriculum for languages, the core strand of the curriculum is communication. And it was designed in such a way that communication was seen as the core, supported by language and culture. And what has been defined from the beginning is that the focus that moved away from a pure linguistic knowledge emphasized language for intercultural communication. So for about, if we start thinking that the curriculum was enacted by 2010, and interestingly, that is the period of time that I have been in New Zealand, it has been very interesting to observe how the uptake of communication, which compared to the rest of the world was a bit late. Most of the world were talking about languages and communication from the 1980s, 1990s. So in New Zealand arrived a bit later. But also the combination of communication and interculturality has been a little bit of intention, because either people pay attention to one thing or to the other, but rarely to the combination of two. So the change in focus has been challenging for practicing teachers. And then again, I hope to demonstrate through the presentation that it has not been easy for everyone to look at what has been happening there. So when I want to present today, and again, it was thanks to conversations that I had with Enrica back in June in Montreal, has to do with my work with teachers and how teachers learn. So we all know that teachers are being asked constantly to adapt because education is changing all the time. And the adaptations range. Sometimes it has to shape, we have to change our views of language learning in new ways. So again, as I said, changing from a very linguistic view to a more communicative, and now to a very intercultural way. Introducing changes and innovations to our teaching constantly. And I could see in your presentations the attention that something like artificial intelligence is having for everyone, of course, and for languages inevitably. Introducing changes and innovations to the teaching, to the pedagogies, to the resources, to the materials. And also changing in the ways we work, because depending on how others make decisions about how a school day goes and what are the areas of the curriculum and how many hours do you have for teaching something, all of those things are changing the teacher's work all the time. And the teachers themselves are involved in all of these processes, but in particular with respect to curriculum, in interpreting, mediating, negotiating, and translating what is said in some documents into what it means for them on their day-to-day practice. And that's the area where I have been quite interested in working. So what I'll present is a little bit of a window on how teachers engage in professional learning, and I'm going to give two different examples, and how they bridge theory and practice, because it is the perennial question for us researchers and practitioners, because most of us come from being teachers ourselves, is that if we want to improve the quality of student learning, which is what drives our work every day, we need to make sure that we're understanding what that theory is telling us and what that means for our practice. So I will be talking a lot about teacher learning, and I apologize because I was revisiting my slides and they're quite busy with text, so I apologize, especially because you are not seeing me there in person. Is that I'll be talking about teacher learning very widely and looking at a range of diverse and often conflicting influences that result in teachers' unique ways of integrating new learning and translating it into their practices. And as you can see for the dates in some of my references, there is nothing new about this. We have been working on this for over 30 years now. But I do want to make sure that everyone understands how I approach my work with teachers learning. And first of all, this positioning themselves as knowers and thinkers who can translate new ideas into their own systems of practice. A recognition that the teachers are reflective professionals, that are curriculum makers, and that their importance of integrating disciplinary inquiry into instruction is instrumental to how they work. And grounding the activity of language teaching and learning in the teacher's own context is something that actually has come to education quite recently if we look at the history of education, right? The systems of education were never designed to account for the importance of the context. And the more we account for the context and we pay attention to the situation in which we are in, the more complex any teacher learning becomes. We are supporting teachers to recognize what is the same and what is different when we engage with them. Sometimes they don't recognize those things. Understanding that learning often requires adopting a new idea that will result in new practices, but also abandoning previous ideas, which interestingly is what we have observed that is more difficult for the teachers. And the possibility of teachers embracing new learning theoretically while continuing to enact their previous understandings without noticing the contradiction. So probably that is what has been more powerful for me and what has been sort of driving what I do, including new projects that I'm looking at. Teachers' response to change historically, for example, is that it is very, very interesting to observe them really embracing any new idea that comes to them. However, once you go and see their practice or they reflect on their practice, there is very little change in what they're doing. And also the other key concept for me today is the concept of inquiry, which again is not new to anyone. And we have, talked about the reflection in action, on action, and for action for many years now. But inquiry is very important in the New Zealand system as it is embedded in the teacher's practice. It is expected all the time, and it is the way they are appraised, actually. So teachers are expected to be being, actively reflective and inquiring into their own teaching all the time. So the idea is that they see themselves as agents of their own learning and construct knowledge and make decisions that take their context into consideration with the potential for improving practice is the magic of inquiry, right? So bringing those ideas into their context, sitting down, observing the students, looking for evidence, talking to their peers, talking to their colleagues, and framing and reframing those problems of practice, looking at alternatives, and eventually modifying their practice if that's what is necessary. And there is access to different types of knowledge that will challenge their practice, but also will push their thinking into thinking about new possibilities. And it's interesting when we see, in another area of my work has been on the applications of technology, but it's interesting to see how technology somehow people tend to see that as a driver, right? They don't realize that other concepts that we bring to them are as important and as sort of leveraging the new practices as technology. But technology seems to be always the one that makes people sort of jump in a more clear way for them, saying, oh, there is new technology, I have to change. I will not be dealing with technology today, but that is interesting to observe how the teachers themselves see those changes a bit differently. Okay, so I will start by talking about, as I said, two different projects, which are the two books that were mentioned in the introduction. The first project is on implementing task-based language teaching. And task-based language teaching has a long history in New Zealand because of the importance of Rod Ellis and his presence in the country since the early 2000s, when he started publishing about this idea about the task and how important the task is and the difference between an activity and a task, etc. Task-based language teaching, although it's not sort of mandated, because as I said, there is no clear mandate anyway, but it is one of the ways in which this idea of teaching and communication started to be mobilized from the early 2000s in New Zealand. So it is a concept that has been embedded in what is done in the country, and the teachers see the task. If you talk to any teacher in New Zealand, or teacher of languages in New Zealand, they will have heard of task-based language teaching. A different story is how much they know about task-based language teaching and whether they are teaching it or not. And what happened is that for many years, the Ministry of Education funded a national program for upskilling teachers who were already in service with ideas about task-based language teaching. So this book comes from a project based on that teaching program, in-service language teaching program. And my colleague Rosemary Erlam and myself, who were involved in the program and who were the teachers of these teachers, decided to look into how the teachers learn about the concept of task, how they implemented it, and how they took it and reflected on what happened with that knowledge in their practice. So this is a project that was a multi-phase research project. So we collected data from one of the cohorts that we were working with. We looked at the course content, and I'll give a little bit of details about that. And we wanted them to make sure that we were accessing their current knowledge as they were learning, but also after they learn. So the year immediately after they finish the program, we follow the same teachers, those who agreed to participate, of course. And then we also looked at some teachers who had been in the project and had taken the course a few years before, and we sort of looked at what happened with them after the project had finished. The in-service program was finished. So, as I said, we wanted to investigate how teachers learned and developed understandings of task and task-based language teaching. We wanted to document whether and how teachers implemented TBLT after the program. So we looked at the course content, we interviewed them, we observed a few of them. And as I said, well, task-based language teaching probably for this audience does not need any clarification, but we come from just the very, very basic idea that students learn a language by performing tasks while they are interacting and making meaning, which again seems, for those of us who have studied this, quite easy to understand, not so much for the teacher. And we use the definition of a language task that Ellis has from the 2003 as the task that requires learners to function as language users, not just as language learners, has some kind of gap that can be closed as a result of the communications that take place, requires learners to rely on the language they know to communicate, and has a clearly defined outcome beyond the linguistic outcome. So as we know, many of us know that definition, not so very easy to have the teachers actually doing something with that. So the realities of task-based language teaching, and again, that's a topic for a completely different conversation, is that much of the literature on task-based language teaching is informed by the world of research rather than by the world of practice. And I have to acknowledge that this has changed in the last 8 to 10 years a lot. There's a lot of more practitioner-driven literature coming about that. It has a focus on teacher learning fundamental to the growth of task-based language teaching as a research pedagogy. So we were very, very mindful that we wanted to have the teacher's voice into what was being understood about the task. Because the role of the teacher is crucial. They are the ones who bring it to life. They are the ones who have to make the decision whether they're going to include it or not. And they are the ones who have to understand what a task is so that they can actually implement and incorporate them into their teaching. So we work with 14 of the 40 teachers that we had on a given year. And as you can see, and I think that's a little bit of a fuzzy table, apologize, is a range of teachers with a range of languages being taught. Their first language was not very diverse. Most of them were English first language speakers, but you can spot some who were speakers of Spanish as a first language or French as a first language, and even a teacher of Tongan, one of the languages of the Pacific. They had studied a range of languages, and you can see in the fourth column the languages that they were teaching at the moment where we studied them. So Spanish, Chinese, French, Japanese, Tongan were the languages. You can also see in the fifth column, the years of teaching experience was wide-ranging. So we have anyone from 4 years to 38 years of experience in the cohort. And most of the teachers were operating at that time at secondary level. So students in high school after year 9, they start year 9 when they are 13 years old. With a few of the teachers teaching in primary. But all the teachers had to, for this course, had to be working with a group of beginners of language, which, as you can see, you will see eventually was a little bit of part of the problem. So as I said, we looked at the course assignments. One of the course assignments was what we call a reading log. Basically, the teachers had to select a reading and do a reflection and a summary and a synthesis of the reading. And what happened with that initial reading is that we started to see that they were starting to look at language learning from a different point of view and develop awareness of their own theories, right? So it came quite clearly what they were doing with the new content and how they were incorporating the new content to what they were already teaching. They were critically reflecting on their own practices. So they said, oh, I now realize that I'm teaching PPP, right? So present, practice, production. They start recognizing that quite quickly and putting that in contrast with what task-based language teaching will ask from them. But they were also very willing to extend their professional knowledge and consider using task and principles of TBLT in their teaching. So, there's always, of course, a teacher will not go into an in-service program without some willingness to change, right? And some willingness to learn. So that was a given. However, I have to say, not all teachers were there because they had signed up for it, but because their schools suggested this program for them. So that was quite interesting to observe also, that some of the teachers were there, not necessarily because they saw a course and say, oh, I want to do this, but because the school was interested in them doing that. But initially, they were just articulating their new understandings of TBLT, and they come to realizations like this quote that I have here, that they actually have to use the language for communication, which again, sounds pretty obvious for those of us who have been in education for a long time, but probably not for the teachers. And this teacher said, I can see that traditional approaches of learning vocabulary lists and grammatical rules will not be enough for meaningful language learning. The cognitive processes students use to acquire language and complete tasks will provide greater opportunities to learn. I feel strongly that language should be understood as a tool for communication rather than a set of rules to be memorized. So this is the sort of reflections that we started seeing from the teachers, where they were actually saying a lot in a quote like this, right? Telling us about their practice, but also telling us about how they are thinking about how the students are using the language and what are the processes involved in language learning. So that was quite interesting to observe quite initially in the course. Eventually, the main assignment in the course was what we call a learning inquiry, which is that they had to actually, in their classes, plan for teaching a task, collecting evidence about the effectiveness of the task. And this was what was interesting, because for most of them, the evidence that they wanted to collect was the motivation from the students, was the reaction and the response of the students to the task, but also the learning, what was being learned. So some way of, assessing what was being learned. So they had to evaluate whether the task had been successful or not, how effective it was in terms of the learning of the students, etc. So that was the central sort of assignment, the one that took longer. And some of the evidence from the inquiry that this was done, of course, towards the end of the program, it was a 9-month program, is that they were at different levels of developing their understandings about tasks. The inquiries themselves were catalysts for an awareness of the range of pedagogical issues that they would need to address when designing and implementing the task. So what was interesting to observe, and these were 3,000-word reports that they were writing about these inquiries, was that they were realizing that, oh, okay, so a task is not just another activity that I bring. I need to plan for this. I need to plan how much language they need. I need to plan for this and that and that. So it was quite interesting to observe that. They actually needed the first-hand experience to connect theory and practice, because they said, oh, I did this, and now I realize that this is what happens with language acquisition, et cetera, et cetera. They struggled to design production tasks. So most of those were output tasks, which were suitable in terms of language demands for learners who were predominantly at beginner level. So they were very obsessed with doing things, but not so much about being mindful that students at beginner level probably can cope much better with input-based tasks. And breaking that present, practice, production cycle and implementing a new approach was difficult for them, requiring a completely new way of thinking about language form. So that was, again, something that we analyzed after they did that. And of course, as teachers in the program, we were also sort of self-assessing our own work. And then when we look at the teachers after a year, they reporting using the task as pedagogic tools with different degrees of regularity embedded in teaching sequences that also included other types of language learning activities, which they were very eclectic on how a task was being introduced in their teaching. However, very encouragingly for us, they were seeing language learning as focused on communication with the students' use of the language as paramount. That was probably sort of the highlight of the project, and I'll rush to show you a little bit more of that. They became acutely aware of the importance of using the Tanger language much more. Because in the lesson observations, we were seeing that they were actually not using the language themselves, the teacher, as input. So they actually started being more aware of that. And again, I apologize because these tables might look a bit fuzzy to you. Very, very quickly, sort of the enablers to implementing task-based language teaching at system level was, first of all, that any experiential language learning aligns very strongly with the New Zealand curriculum. So they really like that, and aligns with the expectations of the foreign language curriculum, and also with the assessment requirements at system level. So that was encouraging for them to see that this was an innovation, but it's an innovation very strongly grounded on what is expected of them anyway. At teacher level, they were having to learn about a different way to teach languages, so they were quite excited about it. It provided a structure and organization for their teaching, which was also important for some of them, and it supported to reflect on practice. And at student level, they all reported increased motivation and engagement, development of fluency in some of them, and use of the language for communication. And for many of them, this was a little bit sort of not surprising, but we were not expecting this so clearly, the possibility of differentiating learning through how they were implementing the task. However, there were also limitations, and as we all know, time is a huge limitation, not only the time that is allocated to the language, but the time that the teacher has available to doing this work. They all have a very busy teaching load, and they were not very sure whether the school was actually very supportive for the innovation, because they were not released as much time as they were hoping to do that. Many of them also mentioned things like access to resources, but also we observed that understanding and designing the task was not easy. Predicting language need by students was not easy for some of them. And at student level, Some of the students, when they were interviewed, say that they would prefer teacher-led activities, that they prefer to have the teacher in front and leading the activities, not so much all of these activities that are more experiential. The fact that it was beginner's level was a huge limiting aspect of what the teachers saw that they could do with the task, and also some conflict with preferred learning styles. So just a final reflection from one of the teachers is that, you have to structure things quite carefully. I don't feel that everything can be done task-based, and I don't think everything should be done task-based. So you try to do task-based as much as you can, as long as it fits in with what you can do. And the more you think about it, the more you realize that you actually can do more things in a task-based manner. But it takes time. It takes time to think about how you're going to present it in a task-based fashion and to build the resources. So this was very common, threads coming through the teachers. So I'll just very briefly conclude this first example, that the teachers mentioned that teaching with tasks had made them put communication at the core of their teaching. That for us was very, very encouraging. A major focus for the teachers was using the target language much more, as they had become aware of their role as input providers and mediators of language learning. TBLT aligns with the wider curriculum and educational aspirations of teaching. None of them considered that they were teaching fully TBLT, and that is something that you can see up and down the country. The tasks were not the exclusive focus of the lessons. They are very eclectic. Teachers approach their new learning about TBLT with positive dispositions, yet with discernment, which resulted in those eclectic practices. So they don't consider themselves converts of TBLT, so to speak. And for us is, this is a program that was quite directed with a lot of support, et cetera, that needed 9 months for something like this to start tracking. Helping the teachers to understand the concept of task is almost like a one-to-one activity. The dichotomies that have differentiated TBLT from other approaches to language teaching and learning are often blurred. So people consider TBLT same as communicative language teaching, same as task-oriented, all of these things. TBLT theory needs to continue to engage with the realities of actual classroom practice. We do think that it is important that, and that's why we call bridging, right? So we are bridging theory and practice. Okay, so that was my first example, and I'll try to present the second one a little bit more synthetic so that I can allow time for questions if necessary. Again, this second example, it is a longer project, believe it or not, than the other one. This was a 2-year project focus on intercultural language teaching, which, as I said, comes in a little bit of tension with the other one. And in many senses, it comes in tension with the focus on communication because people tend to see it separately. I am one person who does not see that separately, but teachers say culture is separate from language and from communication. So we're still at that phase in which teachers are sort of separating one thing from the other. And we wanted to particularly look at what was happening in primary and intermediate schools, sort of the beginning and as of the teaching of intercultural language in the schools. So again, theoretically, language teachers and the development of intercultural communicative competence has not been an easy ride. Again, interculturality arrives very heavily theoretically, heavy, and the actual practice of intercultural language teaching remains at a rudimentary level because there are huge advantages on theoretical understandings, but the difficulties for practitioners to enact theory in their teaching of languages is still present. Again, it has changed in the last 10 years. It has been a very dynamic area to observe, but for teachers to reconceptualize language teaching as encompassing linguistic and intercultural element has not been easy to realize. Developing intercultural stances is a process that is both cognitive and affective, and it impacts teachers' personal theories of teaching as well as their professional identities. We have found that dealing with interculturality is very personal and is very sometimes hard for the teachers because they have to start with the process of their own identities, and this requires a lot of more complexities in how the teachers approach this concept. For example, compared to TBLC. So interculturality not only is a way of teaching, it's also a way for the teachers to see themselves quite differently and what happens in the interaction with the students and what happens with the students and the interaction with the language that they are learning. So besides all of that, we know that there's a number of contextual factors that influence how teachers approach culture in their language classrooms, not the least the fact that the assessment regime has never included interculturality, as we know. So again, another, another topic for another day. Very briefly, I'll talk about the study. What we wanted was to investigate how teachers, in particular in intermediate schools, so those middle years between primary and secondary, how the teachers can support their learners to develop intercultural competence as part of learning an additional language. And we framed this as a collaborative action research. So it's quite a different design from the previous project, where we, the researchers, who are teacher educators, we each partnered with one teacher in a different school in a different location in the country. And this was a project funded by the ministry. So also there was some teacher release and quite a lot of resources for us to travel, etc. And the fact that each of us were teaching in a different school, we framed each of the projects as a case study. And then we brought the team together 4 times over the 2 years for a residential meeting so that we could all work on our collective understandings. So it's quite a different one. And as I said, it's a different also in the fact that the teachers who are in those year levels, primary and intermediates, they are not language specialists, of course, right? They are qualified elementary teachers with different degrees of proficiency in the target language. Not many of them have actually strong groundings in the second language pedagogy. They were not, they were teaching the language, but same as they would teach mathematics or health or social sciences, right? So they were still finding their way into introducing effective language programs. And the fact that we arrived with this project was like, what? This is completely new. No one told us about that. However, most of them were very, very interested in this idea of interculturality. Again, very briefly, 5 different teachers across languages, 2 by chance of Chinese, Japanese, French, and Tereo Maori, located in different areas of the country, and teaching, as you can see in the bottom of the screen, their language programs were quite differently timetabled. For many of them, they did not have enough time with the learners. Sometimes only 30 minutes per week. That was how much as they had. And I will present some selected findings. I'm very aware of my time. And basically what happened is that we looked at the teachers and we also looked at the students in this project. For the teachers, an obvious benefit was the increased intercultural focus. They started by having to make their intercultural understandings explicit. So the fact that these were inquiries also started with their own understandings of that. The teachers' language teaching practices changed. There was a noticeable shift in the way they view the place of culture in language teaching. Before the project, most of them were just seeing culture as something peripheral and additional and something fun that you can do on a Friday afternoon. That was like a game or something. They didn't see how it was actually very, very complex in presenting this and expecting that the students who are very multicultural themselves, especially the students who were operating in the big cities, they were approaching this new intercultural learnings about these other languages that were spoken, that they were learning, and how they came with all of this intercultural content themselves. The second benefit was the impact of reflection as part of the teaching inquiry. So the inquiry cycle that they follow requires stepping back and examining beliefs and practices and willingness to change. But also very importantly for them was to make sure that they were actually reflecting based on the data and evidence from their own teaching. So that brought deeper understanding on their own professional identities and how they were seeing teaching more widely. So that was quite interesting. And some of the teachers felt liberated that they now could see language not only as this grammar and vocabulary, but also, a bit more wider. And they also saw that the students were developing a greater openness to otherness. So that was very interesting because the teachers could see their students opening their eyes literally to how other people live and how other people felt, and the sort of more experiential view of culture, not just that objectification of culture as something that happens peripherally out there on Fridays only. There was also a perceived increase in motivation and a sense of increased connection to a wider world, because that is something that for New Zealand is quite important because we are so remote from everyone. And although it is very multicultural in our classrooms, the actual presence of those other worlds is quite remote. Also, the challenges, of course, as I said, at personal level, concerns under lack of sufficient knowledge about the target culture and a consequent anxiety that they may pass on inaccurate information. They were very insecure about that, or that they might embed uninformed stereotypical thinking into their students. So that was something that was quite important for them to not do. The lack of time to undertake a meaningful intercultural exploration, and concern about unsustainability of this level of intercultural inquiry. So being very realistic, as this is very nice, you're helping us here, we're being released, but I cannot do this on my daily teaching. And then some curricular and pedagogical challenges that they expressed concern that an intercultural focus detracted them from learning the language. And this is something that we have come to see in the teaching with an intercultural focus, that they see that as taking away from the language. It has been very hard to find a way that they see it as supporting the language. And they struggled with an apparent incompatibility between language learning and intercultural reflection, because of course, the students, especially beginner students, have to be prompted to reflect in their main language, in English, which is their dominant language, not in the language. So we were separating by design how they were conducting their reflection. But for the students, we could see some emergent intercultural growth. They actually were quite interested. There was a progression in the way that they were engaging with interculturality. There was some increase in motivation, and they are started to notice difference and to developing openness to difference. But also for the students, there were some unexpected outcomes that we didn't see coming. That they were actually frequently prompted to make reference to what they were learning. So in different classes, they were talking about what they were learning. And they were using the target language much more than before, and they had a heightened motivation for future language and learning more about language. They were actually quite interested in languages, much more, and this is reported by the teachers, than their previous cohorts. So there were certain things that we actually were not expecting to see and were happening. So I'll wrap up this project also in some of the reflections of how we concluded the project, is that the reconceptualization of language teaching as encompassing both linguistic and intercultural element has not been easy. So we come back to the same idea that we started with, right? It's not really easy. It is full of complexities. Developing intercultural stances is a process that is both cognitive and affective, and it impacts teachers' personal theory. So again, we were going back to this idea from Michael Byram, that because it is not only a thinking process, as many of the innovations that we ask for the teacher, but this is a very personal and affective domain. This makes it more complex, and more complex even for us to research, because who are we to push the teacher to think this way or that way, right? Who are we to expect the students to all of a sudden start seeing the world differently? Literally, we're changing their world when we bring interculturality to their classroom. And teachers may not have confronted their own conceptualizations and understandings of interculturality. it was clear with these 5 teachers that this was the first time that they had thought about these ideas and these complexities. Not that they were not teaching culture, but that they were not seeing it as a personal process of engaging with someone's life very differently. And often they do not fully understand the role in the development of intercultural stances in their students. So that is something that for us was quite evident in how we saw the teachers learning about interculturality. And then there's a number of contextual factors, as I said, not the least that language has very little time, and this needs a lot of time. So a lot of the lessons learned, I'm drawing here to a close already. So learning from reflection and inquiry. For us and seeing, and I'll talk about the 2 projects in a moment, but for this project in particular, strong influence of the way the teachers had learned languages, definitely. The teachers incorporated their emerging understandings of theory and research to their existing knowledge, which is good. The process of reflection supported the teachers in examining their implicit and often unexamined understandings about language learning and teaching as a prelude to acquiring new content knowledge that they might use for pedagogical purposes. What this means is that it needs a lot of time. And of course, we cannot reach all the teachers who are in schools already. So those of us in teacher education feel that in pre-service, we now have to do all of these things, right? But again, our time is very, very limited. Through structured reflection, teachers make explicit their developing understandings, appropriate a language to describe their practices, and connect new knowledge to their existing knowledge. That for us was quite important, that to make sure that that was happening. Teachers need to agree with the relevance of any innovation prior to its adoption. So we felt that although we framed this as a collaborative action inquiry, that the teachers felt that we were somehow imposing this new knowledge on them. Which is true. It was our agenda. We approached those schools which we had worked with before, and some of these teachers we had worked with before in different capacities, but we had our agenda about interculturality. So that is an acknowledgement. So it is very hard for us to sort of separate our own agendas from what we wanted to do. Very importantly, engagement in data-driven reflection brought about deeper understandings of the teacher's professional identity. So again, inquiries and all of this process are not an easy fix, so it takes a lot of time. But the fact that the teachers were seeing evidence from their own learners, and then when we did the residential meetings where they were sharing what they were seeing, they were like, oh, okay, so it's not only me, this is happening to the others. And we have to look at the evidence of student learning in order for us to actually be convinced that this is something worth going into. And as we know, any change in beliefs and practices need to align with other elements of the teaching context. So if the school is not giving them the time, if they can only see the students for 30 minutes and that's it, it is going to be very hard and very lengthy for them to actually see any changes on what's happening with the learners. So just drawing final conclusions in the 2 studies, what we saw is that these curricular innovations have followed similar patterns of implementation. Both projects provided evidence of the tensions between the goals of language teaching, either language and communication, language and interculturality, and the teachers' own efforts to resolve those tensions. In both studies, teachers appreciated the opportunities to reflect individually and collectively, so that was quite important and refreshing. A way of addressing possible mismatches between teachers' beliefs about curricular innovations and practices is through supporting teachers' critical examination of their values, beliefs, and practices. And again, that is not easy, and we're still trying to find ways of doing that. The inquiry process allows teachers to construct their professional identities as agentive and reflective professionals with the ultimate goal of improving student learning. So that for me is quite important as a teacher educator. The implementation of any innovation is a complex endeavor that involves a gradual process of learning where teachers mold the novel content to their own context and their own practices. And that's why it's so expensive and so difficult, because each context will require a different solution, a different reflection, a different inquiry. Teachers do not just deliver the existing curriculum, they are valuable contributors to curriculum making. So for me, that is very important that they realize that in what they do every day, they are making curriculum and they're giving life to the curriculum that someone external to them often writes and delivers for them. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you very, very much.